Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody to St. Francis College. My name is Frank Sorrentino, and I'll be giving the lecture today on presidential power. I need to acknowledge that this is sponsored by Speakers in the Humanities, a great program that helps bring discussions of social science and humanities throughout the state of New York. And I've been doing this for about 12 years, so I'm very, very happy to be part of this program. I also want to indicate that this is the first of 3 talks that I'll be giving, and you may want to mark your calendar, or you may want to wait till after the lecture to decide whether you want to come to the other 2. On April 11th, also a Wednesday, at 12:30, the talk will be on leadership in America, which will talk a little bit about the American presidency, but leadership in a more general terms. Leadership is not only political leadership. Leadership happens in churches, in organizations, in not-for-profits, and in movements. And clearly we're going to be dealing with that. On April 25th, the anticipation was that my new book would be out. I'm still holding some hope for that, but it's in the presses as we speak, and if it's out by the 25th, I will be signing autographed copies, only to those who purchase it, of course, but we'll be doing that. So that is going to be a discussion about how the presidency functions in a society of expertise, a society of bureaucratic power, a society in which bureaucracies have not only the strength of advice, implementation, and propaganda, but also the support of interest groups and congressional committees and subcommittees. So it's a trilogy, and I hope you enjoy all 3 of them. I also would like to dedicate this talk to my mom. She recently passed away. And she was always a source of inspiration and encouragement. And one of the things that we always used to have is whenever I give a talk, my mom would say, well, they're going to love you. And I said, well, you know, maybe they not. And it was sort of like this Jerry Seinfeld parody, how could they not love you? And we went back and forth. I said, well, there are times. So, but she did give me a tremendous amount of confidence, and we're very, very grateful to have had her all the years. Today, I want to talk about presidential power. And presidential power has to be understood in such a complex way. I think when we talk about the presidency, we like to talk about Lincoln, because Lincoln is not only an iconic figure, but he's a figure who helped explain the powers of the presidency and how a president may think or not think. In a letter to one of his friends, Albert Hodge, he wrote it this way. He says, was it possible to lose the nation and preserve the Constitution? By general law, life and limb must be protected. Yet often a limb must be amputated to save a life. But a life is never wisely given to save a limb. I felt that measures otherwise unconstitutional might become lawful by becoming indispensable to the preservation of the nation. Right or wrong, I assume this ground and now vow to it. The reason why I start with Lincoln is that if we look at the Constitution, we're going to get a very limited view of the powers of the presidency. The presidency is a work in progress. It is dependent upon not only the occupants, but also the demands of the society, the conditions in which presidents find themselves. And of course, there is no greater crisis than the Civil War. The Civil War created a necessity, in Lincoln's view, to do things that would be considered totally unconstitutional. Matter of fact, Clinton Rossiter once said that Lincoln represented a constitutional dictatorship. That is an oxymoron. The word constitutional means to limit, and a dictatorship means without limits. But of course, in the hands of Lincoln, it was viewed as wanting to preserve the dominant values, even though technically he had moved away from them. So we're going to use Lincoln as our metaphor for today. And I believe that when we unpeel the different layers of the presidency, we'll get a good idea of how the presidency functions not only today, but how it has functioned over the 200 and plus years. The first thing I'd like to begin with is the duality of the presidency. The president is both the head of government and the head of state. In this sense, he represents the symbolic and the ceremonial dimensions of American society. He is, in effect, the monarch and the head of government. In Britain, we would divide those roles, and we would have the Queen and we'd have the Prime Minister. The president receives the adulation. The president receives the deference. The president is the symbolic leader who leads us not only in times of great crises, but great loss and great triumph. Many people believe that the merger of these two roles is really difficult for the president. Matter of fact, it's not written in the Constitution. George Washington created this role of chief of state. He believed that the people needed to have someone who would be a unifier. But the Queen, as we know, does not engage actively in politics. When the last king attempted to be involved in politics, we conveniently found a way for the king to say that he was resigning to marry the woman he loved. Poppycock, right? He was warning against involvement in World War II, involvement against the Nazis. Some people believed he was a Nazi sympathizer. What we do know is that he was opposed to Britain's entry into the war, and this was unacceptable. We want a unifying figure who stays above politics and not deeply involved in politics. This creates contradiction, it creates tension, and it creates a sense of power that a president may not have. A president lives in a castle. The White House is a castle. A modest castle, but a castle nonetheless, right? The president has all sorts of bands and aides that try to give the notion of the grandeur of the nation. This creates the impression that the president has great power. And one of the problems is when people perceive that you have great power, all the problems, all of the things that go badly are laid at your door. Presidents have tremendous expectations that they can change the world and they can change the nation. Presidents revel in this, but at their own peril, because there are things that presidents can't control. They can't control what other foreign nations do. They can't control markets. They can't even control their own political party. But the expectations and the disappointment create one of the most important difficulties that the modern American president faces. In addition to that, there's another duality. In American politics, what we have is a situation in which we look at Congress, we look at the courts, and we look at them as individuals. But these individuals are faceless. We don't know their spouse. We don't know their children. We don't know their dog. All right? But a president is personal. We know almost everything about the president. We feel an attachment to the president. And when presidents die, many of us feel some of the same symptoms. We feel depressed. We feel sleepless. We feel as though a member of our own family has passed away. Now, some people say, well, this only happens with popular presidents. Not true. Warren Harding may have won 60% of the vote, but most people hardly knew him. The sense of family, the sense of intense emotional attachment, the presidency allows for that. But do we know Harry Reid's family? Do we know John Boehner's family? Do we know John Roberts' family? Do we know anything about them? If we saw them on the street, would we recognize them? Well, I would. All right? But most people would not. The presidency, of course, is a celebrity. We have a third duality, and this is a duality that I'm going to spend a lot of time on. Aaron Wildowski, a Brooklyn-born political scientist, and aren't they the best? All right? Aaron Wildowski wrote a book called The Two Presidencies. And what he suggested is that the American constitutional system, both in terms of the law and in terms of practice, have created a presidency which is very powerful, very capable of controlling his or her environment in the foreign policy realm. Matter of fact, he says, too powerful. But in the domestic realm, the presidency is very, very weak. The president doesn't control his own political party. Between separation of powers and federalism, presidents are viewed as one of many policymakers. So the notion here is that we have one presidency, very, very powerful, maybe too powerful, and another presidency, very, very weak, maybe too weak. The paradox of the presidency. Now, with these three dualities, I want to move to our second topic, which of course everybody has a copy here of what we call the president as bargainer. And for this, I'm going to rely heavily on the scholarship of Richard Newstead. Richard Newstead served in the Truman administration, and with that great possibility of serving in government, he then went on to Harvard University and became one of the deans of presidential studies. In that book that he wrote, Presidential Power, he basically says that the president is the chief clerk of the United States. The chief clerk. That the president's power amounts to nothing but the power to bargain. The words he used is the power to persuade. In effect, the president can rarely coerce anyone to do anything. Matter of fact, he recalls Harry Truman contemplating Eisenhower's movement into the White House. And Truman was reported to have said, Ike will say, do this, do that, do the other thing. Nothing will ever get done. Poor Ike. It's not anything like the Army. In effect, the presidency is a mirage. All right? And what we have is a situation, because of separation of powers and because of federalism, a lot of independent sources of power. In fact, if we go to the separation of powers, Montesquieu, who is the intellectual father of the Constitution, the actual father is James Madison. I think I gave a talk a little while ago on that. Montesquieu talked about a notion that we celebrate people when they die. And that's wonderful. But he says we should mourn them when they are born. Fascinating view of life. His notion here was that we're all up to doing no good. And eventually, all of us will do things that not only we regret, but more importantly, other people will regret. James Madison takes this notion and says, ambition must counteract ambition. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. In fact, the American system is based on the notion that power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Lord Acton could not have been sitting in the Philadelphia Convention and been happier. The concept here is that Americans distrust power. They distrust the concentration of power. And we've created a system in which not only is there a separation of powers of an executive, a legislature, and a judiciary, but then we take a legislature and we divide that further into two houses. And then we create a political party system in which even someone like Eisenhower would say, there's no such thing as the Republican Party. There's no such thing as the Democratic Party. There are 50 Democratic parties and there are 50 Republican parties. If Eisenhower had taken my course, he would have said there are 3,000 Democratic parties and 3,000 Republican parties. Each county is its own party. Each county decides who the candidate is. Each county makes the decision of who gets elected within those congressional districts. And if I'm not loyal to my district, if I cannot remain popular in my district, what happens? I soon become the ex-representative, the ex-senator. No one's going to persuade senators and representatives from North Carolina to end tobacco subsidies. No one is going to persuade the people in Wisconsin that dairy subsidies are not a good thing. In effect, the president cannot protect anybody. You stand exposed. And what Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local. I must be popular, and if it means defying the leaders of my party, the president of my party, by all means, let me do that. All right? All politics is local. So what happens here is that when a president attempts to get legislation through, he does not have a built-in majority like a David Cameron has in Great Britain. He must work each decision, each policy as sui generis, as unique. Let me give you an example. Going back to Newstead, we'll look at the particular experience of Truman and MacArthur. Clearly, there was a difference of opinion about how to conduct the Korean War. Truman was skeptical of a large land war in the Asian continent. Of course, he's the one who initiated the war, but that's something else. All right? But he believed that the Chinese, if they were to get involved, what would happen would be endless war, high casualties, and that the United States would lose the nerve, lose the will to fight. MacArthur, on the other hand, who was the commander in the Pacific, the person who believed that the war was fought poorly in so many ways, that political decisions overrided military decisions. He believed that the Truman administration, in particular, allowed for the Soviet Union to support Mao Zedong while we sat on our hands and allowed Chiang Kai-shek to be removed from power. He believed that the United States could take this opportunity and remove Mao Zedong, that the communist power in China was not permanent, it was not stable, and matter of fact, it was highly fragile. Now, 2 points of view. But they're also two different men. Harry Truman was the accidental president. Right? Here's a man who becomes vice president 1 month, right, before Franklin Roosevelt dies in the arms of his mistress. But that's not relevant. The key element is that Harry Truman was a product of the Pendergast machine. And the Pendergast machine was very similar to Tammany Hall. It was a quid pro quo arrangement. You wanted to open a house of prostitution, you contributed money, you contributed support, and you had protection. You wanted gambling, you did that. You wanted to become a police commissioner, a police captain, you engaged in the political trade-offs. Harry Truman was the last man without a college education to become president, but he was a very shrewd politician. Matter of fact, people saw him as a politician. They saw him as a failed haberdasher who succeeded because of his political skills. Now, I may be wrong, but in American culture, the concept of, quote, being a politician is not something that people say with great pride. I've tried it in the drinking establishment, say, hi, I'm a politician. It doesn't work, all right? Now, MacArthur was a general of the Army. MacArthur's father was a general. He went to West Point. He was #1 in his class. He almost had a 4.0 index. Of course, that was before great inflation, okay? Here was a man who was also a first baseman, a star athlete, who during the Pacific, when he was giving press conferences and when he was giving orders to his men, there were snipers shooting past him. A man of courage. A man who believed he had a destiny. We're not only talking about two views of the Korean War, but we're also talking about two individuals who are perceived wildly differently. Truman may be right, but MacArthur had support. MacArthur had deference. MacArthur had all of the requisite authority. And when Truman decided to relieve MacArthur of his command, MacArthur came back to the United States. And he was given a ticker tape parade, the largest ticker tape parade until the Giants won the Super Bowl. But we called it the Canyon of Heroes. A hero, if we want to use Joseph Campbell or the Greeks, was not someone who caught a football. It was not someone who got a base hit, but someone who risked his life for a cause greater than himself. Almost 2/3 of the members of Congress at that time had served under Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur gives a joint speech, or a speech in front of a joint session of Congress. And his famous last words, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." Almost everyone listening to that speech had tears in their eyes. It didn't matter that the president was the commander-in-chief. It didn't matter that he may have had the better argument. What happened was he had just dismissed the most powerful individual in America, the most popular, the most respected individual. What happened to Truman? His popularity dropped 25 points. There were measures to introduce articles of impeachment. Harry Truman made a decision subsequently that he would not seek re-election. In effect, the Truman presidency was destroyed for doing something that was clearly within his power. Right? One of the great paradoxes of the presidency. We say the presidency is weak, but here it's clear. His authority is without question. But let's do a more contemporary example. 1960. Of course, I must be getting old because 1960 doesn't seem that long ago. I was a kid, all right? Very young kid, okay. The 1960 election is a fascinating election. In that election, we have Senator John F. Kennedy and Vice President Richard M. Nixon. And while there are many issues that are going on at that time, one of the biggest issues was the issue of what we call missile gap. All right? Allen Dulles, who was the CIA chief, viewed Eisenhower as a man who allowed the Soviet Union to leapfrog the United States in missile technology and missile deployment. Many people believed that Allen Dulles had a vendetta against Eisenhower because Eisenhower is one of the few presidents with enough experience and knowledge of military affairs to say no. And Eisenhower said no a lot. Allen Dulles briefs John F. Kennedy and says that the old man has made America vulnerable. Missile gap, missile gap, missile gap. Well, the election happens on November 8th, and one of the first things that John F. Kennedy realizes as president-elect, that Allen Dulles was full of beans. That the United States had a vast, vast superiority in nuclear weapons and nuclear delivery systems. Now, obviously, if you're president of the United States, you're going to say, well, you know what? I won under false pretenses. Here, Dick, you become president. That's not how the game is played. Kennedy thought this was a good thing, even though his credibility was somehow strained by this. He believed, however, and I think rightfully so, that advantages are transitory. That what needs to happen is a constant technological innovation, right? That what is superiority today may be inferiority tomorrow. And one of the things that he recommended very, very early in his presidency was that the United States remove the land-based missiles in Turkey and in Italy. Now, these were called Jupiter-based missiles. And Jupiter-based missiles, this was the first generation of these missiles. These missiles, of course, like software, right? I never buy version 1.0. Of course, I never buy version 2.0 either, but that's beside the point, right? You want them to get all the kinks out. So this technology, these Jupiter-based missiles, were, in effect, limited in range, limited in payload, and limited in accuracy. But even more importantly, what happens is that with these missiles, both in Turkey and Italy, two countries with large communist parties, that the leaders of these parties were viewed as sycophants to the United States. And therefore, their power was jeopardized. So in effect, not only were these missiles ineffectual, all right, but they were also jeopardizing American allies. I mean, just imagine if we allowed missiles in Missouri from some other country, how that might be viewed in a nationalistic ethos. Well, Kennedy had a solution, and his solution was simple. Remove the missiles, but replace them with Polaris submarines. And these Polaris submarines would have a greater payload. In other words, they could do more damage. They would be more accurate. They would move around because they're ships. And they could be submerged, which means that the Soviet Union could not detect where they were. In effect, this was win, 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 win. Losing track of the wins. There's a lot of wins. All right? As we like to say, a no-brainer. And of course, there's a different view of this. When we talk about Polaris submarines, we're also talking about the Navy. And Kennedy was a Navy man. And he believed that naval forces were more important than military forces, the Army. And what that also meant was that there were winners and losers, right? The Army was going to lose power, prestige, command, resources, while the Navy would grow. Well, where I come from in politics, people don't give up that easily. Well, most of this is forgotten. And then we have something called the Bay of Pigs invasion. This is an invasion, covert operation, initiated by the Eisenhower administration, but given the go-ahead under the Kennedy administration. And we often have to associate the word fiasco. I mean, you can't say the word Bay of Pigs without also including fiasco. And the fiasco is this. The invaders, mostly Cuban exile citizens had to be rescued by the Cuban army. That's never good. All right? If I'm going to invade a country, I don't want to have to be rescued. All right? Now, there are a lot of reasons for all of these problems. All right? Some would argue that Kennedy was misinformed, or he was concerned about American involvement. He wanted what we call plausible deniability. All right, a great word during the Cold War, where presidents could often say, well, I didn't do it. All right, someone else did it. Well, regardless of who is responsible, all right, it is a fiasco. All right. Fidel Castro and Nikita Khrushchev engaged in dialogue, and we're not quite sure who made the recommendation, but the belief was that the second invasion by the United States would not be so poorly done. All right? And the suggestion here is that we would put the Soviet Union would put intermediate-based missiles on the island of Cuba. Now, to borrow another phrase, this is a game changer. All right? Not like the movie. This is a real game changer. While the Soviet Union had intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, as I indicated, they were quite inferior. They were not particularly accurate. So if you attempt to hit New York, who knows? You may hit Camden. All right? Not very good. Not very good. But these missiles had more power than the ICBMs, and they were far more accurate. Hence, places like New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, Atlanta, Miami, Chicago, St. Louis were vulnerable. Right? Kennedy believed that this was unacceptable. Totally unacceptable. And what he wanted to do was to knock out those missiles. Matter of fact, one of the individuals who was about to knock out those missiles was a young John McCain, right? 1962. We're talking about a long time ago. It's amazing he's still around. Look, that's a political figure. Excuse me. All right. The key element here is that Kennedy is told that an attack may not be effective, and that if the Soviet Union and Cuba may decide to use the missiles rather than lose the missiles. And people thought I couldn't talk and write. All right? So what happens here is one of the more complex issues confronting the Kennedy administration. In fact, if they attempted to knock out the missiles, they may cause the very nuclear war that they were hoping to prevent. Matter of fact, we had a policy with the Soviet Union that was described as MAD, mutual assured destruction. So clearly, the idea was not to start a nuclear war because the damage could be so awesome that it would only be a Pyrrhic victory if you did emerge successfully from it. So they go to strategy number 2. And strategy number 2 was called a quarantine. Now, a quarantine doesn't have any place in the lexicon of war. A quarantine is a blockade. It is an act of war. And Kennedy gave the order that if any Soviet ship came, all right, in the blockade area, that they would have to stop, and that American destroyers and American personnel would go on board and check the cargo, check if there was any contraband. In other words, anything related to a military purpose would be taken from them, or they would be sent back home. This was one of the most tense periods in Soviet American history, and I may say in the history of civilization, if that's what we call it. Right? Matter of fact, Dean Rusk, who was the Secretary of State at the time, who wasn't known for his colorful language, has been immortalized by his famous expression, "We were eyeball to eyeball." Right? In effect, we were waiting to see who would blink. Right? Khrushchev did not want to blink. Kennedy did not want to blink, but neither wanted nuclear war. Ultimately, the vast superiority of the American arsenal, the notion that Cuba may not have been as important to the Soviet Union as the Soviet Union was to the Soviet Union, made Khrushchev blink. He sends a telegram. Actually, he sends two telegrams. Right? The first telegram is much more willing to negotiate. Second telegram, he pulls back a little bit. What he basically suggests is that if the United States would remove the missiles from Turkey, then the Soviet Union would remove the missiles from Cuba. Right? Now, from a geopolitical military strategy, this is win-win, right? In effect, Kennedy had unilaterally called for the withdrawal of the missiles from Turkey. So in effect, he was getting the Soviet Union to remove the missiles from Cuba for nothing. It was phenomenal. Phenomenal. But Kennedy was incensed. After all, what were the missiles still doing in Turkey? Okay? In effect, John F. Kennedy, as president, realized that he had the power to get the second most powerful nation in the world to change their behavior, but he couldn't get his own army to do what he had ordered. The paradox of the presidency. Right? The U.S. Army had alliances. Had alliances in Congress. It had alliances with interest groups. It had the ability to influence that what would we do with these missiles? What would happen to the Turkish government? What would happen to other governments if they saw the United States unilaterally moving its defense? What we see here is that the bureaucracy, elements of the military, elements of his own political party were lined up in a manner and shape and form that prevented Kennedy from getting what he had ordered. And this was ordering it as the commander-in-chief, where we say he has power. Domestically, president's power is far, far less. But this sort of brings about the whole notion of the limits of the presidency. But let's go to the domestic president, all right, as you follow along here. Domestically, presidents have been notoriously weak, as Aaron Wildowski had demonstrated. All right? The presidents do have tools, right? They have the tool of recommending, and this power has been enhanced by electronic communications, all right, where the president's words are heard throughout the United States and throughout the globe. But even that has changed, right? Because now with cable TV, with VCRs, DVD players, Blu-rays, right? No one has to listen to the president. Again, maybe revealing my own age, I remember a time when there were only 7 channels in New York, all right? And the major networks all carried the president's speech. In fact, in those days, we even had remote control. My father would hit me in the head and said, go change the channel. All right, that was a remote control. All right, but there was we digress a little bit here. The key element was that this power that sometimes is associated with Teddy Roosevelt and the bully pulpit is an important power. Certainly, presidents are able to get their ideas across. People listen to the president. But the president doesn't depend just on recommendation. The president has the power of the veto. But this is also interesting from a historical and constitutional point of view. it wasn't until Andrew Jackson who decided that he would veto based upon his preferences. Prior to Andrew Jackson, most presidents, most members of the Congress, most constitutional scholars believed that the veto was a tool to prevent unconstitutional acts by Congress. But here we have Andrew Jackson, sometimes known as King Andrew, and the political party in opposition was the Whigs, copied from the Whigs in Britain who were opposed to the crown. King Andrew begins this power. This power is enhanced greatly, all right, by the power of Franklin Roosevelt. We could mention Grover Cleveland, but a lot of times when we mention Grover Cleveland, we get into his child out of wedlock, and I don't want to go there, okay? Okay, you're forcing me. No, all right. But Franklin Roosevelt vetoes 635 bills, right? He vetoed more bills than all presidents combined. Matter of fact, he used to go to his staff and say, give me a bill that I can veto. Let me teach those sons of bitches who's in charge. Those are his words, not mine. I would never use such language. All right? The key element is that Franklin Roosevelt had maybe some of the greatest political instincts and skills of any American politician. We could have another debate, maybe another lecture next semester, on Franklin Roosevelt. But the key element here is that Franklin Roosevelt had huge majorities of his own party. In 1932, he wins 60% of the vote. He sweeps in almost 3/4 of Democrats into the Senate. All right? The House of Representatives is about 65-35. Right? Huge majorities. But he's still vetoing. All right? Because he knows that the veto can be an offensive power. He's going to deny you what you want if you don't give him what he wants. And Franklin Roosevelt is, without a doubt, the most successful legislative president in American history. Now, like all presidents, they delude themselves. They have a belief in their self-importance, their omnipotence, their omniscience, nature. And in 1936, all right, he wins an even more remarkable election. He wins 46 out of 48 states. All right? There used to be an expression, as Maine goes, so goes the nation. We had to change the expression, as Maine goes, so go Vermont. A little change a little bit. Right? Franklin Roosevelt is feeling powerful. Very, very powerful. But what is happening on the domestic front, his successful legislation is essentially being found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. That pesky little institution. Right? Well, Franklin Roosevelt was angry, and he came up with a solution. And his solution was that he would add new members to the Supreme Court. But he did it in what some people would say a disingenuous way. He said that he was concerned that 6 of the 9 members were over 70 years of age. And they were just too tired. It wasn't fair. I contend that he wasn't concerned about their age, their workload. What he was concerned was how they were voting. One of the most important cases is a case here in Brooklyn, the Schechter Poultry case. All right, my favorite case. The Schechter Poultry case were 2 brothers, Pinkin Avenue, all right, the Schechter brothers, selling chickens. But they're selling chickens more cheaply than the National Industrial Recovery Act requires. Their idea was that they wanted to increase their market share. Well, they were told, no, Schechter brothers did it anyway. You always figure two brothers from Brooklyn are going to outwit a president of the United States. And they go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules that the National Industrial Recovery Act is unconstitutional. Right? So, what do we have to do? We have to change the court. So Franklin Roosevelt makes a proposal that there would be 6 additional justices. Presumably, if he was losing 5-4, he would win 10-5. He allowed some margin of errors. Right? Now, one would think Franklin Roosevelt won 2 great elections. He had swept his party into power. Surely they would be grateful. They would be deferential. They would do what the great wise men suggested. But they didn't. Large members of his own party rebelled. They started yelling at him, condemning him as someone who was violating the constitutional principles, that he was more interested in his power and his ego than he was as a faithful tribune to the American people. Oh, how the power and the mighty can fall. Franklin Roosevelt's power descends. And then there is a second Great Recession. Talk about double dip. These things are not new. Between the court-packing fiasco, I love that term, fiasco, all right, with the second recession, with the anger among his own party members, there is the suggestion here that the second term of Franklin Roosevelt is a term of impotence. As some have suggested, there's not enough Viagra in the world to revive that presidency. However, Franklin Roosevelt decides to run in 1940 for an unprecedented third term. And what we have, in the words of Winston Churchill, is the gathering storm. Right? Certainly we know, as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, the anger in Germany, the inflation that emerges, leads to political chaos. And out of this chaos, one Adolf Hitler comes to power. Now, originally, Roosevelt was indifferent towards him. He believed that he was a European creature and even supported Joseph P. Kennedy to be ambassador to the court of St. James. Of course, he was setting Kennedy up. Kennedy had a similar view to the king. He believed that the United States should not get involved. All right? He believed that Germany was only interested in reclaiming German-speaking territories. Places like Austria, the Sudetenland, the Netherlands, right? And of course, we have the great talk about appeasement that takes place in Munich. But what emerges is that Franklin Roosevelt begins to see that the real power of the presidency is not domestic, right, but is in foreign policy. And it is in this area that we're able to move into our fourth area, the president as command. Franklin Roosevelt uses not only all the powers that previous presidents have, but he is granted additional powers because the Supreme Court during this time period had taken away power domestically, but actually added power in foreign policy. My most famous case that I love to talk about is United States versus Curtis Wright. In this obscure civil war in the Chaco, all right, Bolivia, all right, what we have is Franklin Roosevelt issuing an order that no American munition firms, armament firms, could sell their equipment, all right, to any of the combatants. Well, Curtis Wright, one of the Wright part of it, is the Wright brothers. All right? And they say, where in the Constitution does it say that the president has a right to stop individuals from selling their own goods? Well, the Supreme Court, Justice Sutherland, the same man who was constantly talking about in the Schechter Poultry case, in the Carter versus Carter coal case, cases that I spend my whole nights thinking about. I don't have much of a life. No, these are the things that really excite me. Sutherland makes the argument that the president's power does not come from the Constitution, but it is an inherent power that comes from the King of England and transferred over to the president as a sovereign. That a president is not accountable to the Congress. He's only accountable to himself. Wow. Wow. Even today, when we talk about different discussions about whether an American president can kill individuals that they identify as enemies, it is based upon the U.S. versus Curtis Wright case. That the president is independent. That he would have all these powers, regardless of what is stated in the Constitution. There are a couple of other cases. U.S. versus Belmont was one of my favorite cases as well. I don't spend nights on U.S. versus Belmont, but it's a good case anyway. In that case, the Supreme Court rules on the whole issue of the United States and the Soviet Union recognizing itself. Some of you may recall, I don't mean this personally, that Woodrow Wilson broke off relations, all right? And he actually sent troops to try to restore the Tsar during the Russian Civil War. But Roosevelt wanted to reestablish relations. And one of the things that had happened, though, was that the Soviet Union, particularly under Joseph Stalin, all right, one of those guys who sometimes we have the name Uncle Joe. I certainly hope I don't have an uncle like him, all right? He basically seized all the property of anybody who left. So there were lots of Americans of Russian ancestry who had large amounts of property. There was money in banks that Stalin had seized. And what Stalin insisted is that we will only exchange ambassadors if you agree that in an executive agreement that these American citizens have no claim on this land. In other words, the President of the United States has basically taken all of these people's property, all of their rights, and say, you know what? In the name of foreign policy, you lost. Now, what is remarkable about this case is that the Supreme Court rules that an executive agreement that is not ratified by the Senate is the equivalent of a treaty. So what we have here is a further increase in the power of the presidency. Executive agreements, inherent powers, Curtis Wright. But let me add some more, right? I don't know how much time we have, but we're going to add as much as we can, right? Korematsu. In that infamous case, initially, the President of the United States issues an executive order basically saying, as Commander-in-Chief, I believe that the Japanese Americans, all right, are a threat to the United States, and therefore they will be interned. Now, of course, what a lot of people don't also recognize is that German Americans and Italian Americans were also interned. What we find remarkable about this case is it is done on the signature of the president. Commander-in-Chief. What does that mean? This is what Harold Wildowski was talking about, of how powerful a president is. But what we have to recognize is that Roosevelt was building on what Abraham Lincoln had done. Abraham Lincoln had suspended the writ of habeas corpus, right? The identification of the charges against you. And while most people love Lincoln, I mean, you gotta be true to things. He said, you know what? Habeas corpus should have been in Article 2, but it was in Article 1. I think the framers made a mistake. Poppycock. They knew where they put it. The power of Congress to declare war, Congress to raise armies and navies, to spend money. It would be the power of Congress to suspend the writ of habeas corpus in war. Lincoln said, as commander-in-chief, I have the ability to raise an army and a navy without Congress. I have the ability, all right, to blockade ports without Congress. I have the ability to arrest journalists, to arrest members of the state legislature. Wow. In fact, when you add the Lincoln contribution to the power of the presidency, and then you combine that, what happened during Roosevelt's term, and the Supreme Court cases that reaffirmed those powers, we have created a juggernaut, a power that is almost uncontrolled. Now, there are a couple cases that have limited the president. All right, certainly Youngstown, Sheet and Steel have limited the president when Truman wanted to seize the steel mills. We certainly know that during the Nixon administration, U.S. versus Nixon, where the call was for unlimited executive secrecy, all right? So, in effect, we do have some of these things. But overall, the presidency becomes almost unchallenged in foreign policy. During World War II, Franklin Roosevelt decided that the neutrality acts that were passed by Congress didn't mean anything. And he ignored them. And when he wanted to aid Great Britain, he basically engaged in lend-lease. He said that he could engage in any agreement he wanted, even if what the United States was to receive in return was a piddly nothing. So Franklin Roosevelt emerges and creates a presidency very, very powerful. He threatens Congress that if you don't pass legislation, I'll just initiate it by executive order. Wage and price controls, control over regulations. He could do whatever Dr. World War II required. And that's how he referred to himself. Wow. Now, of course, what's different between Lincoln and Roosevelt was after Lincoln, the Civil War is over. And of course, he didn't count on being assassinated, but who counts on those things? And Andrew Johnson was particularly inept in so many ways. But there is a resurgence of Congress. There's a resurgence of the Constitution. There's the notion that this was a crisis. The Civil War, the greatest crisis in American history. In effect, one could argue that what we have here is the prerogative theory that had been articulated by people like John Locke, or Alexander Hamilton saying that the president had the ability to do whatever is necessary in any emergency. But after World War II, it's different. Because the United States emerges as a great nation, the most powerful nation. The United States is not going to disarm. It's not going to descript its army. So for the first time in American history, in a time of peace, Cold War peace, the president is going to have at his disposal large military operational capability, large systems of weapons, nuclear weapons, first atomic weapons, right? All kinds of weapons that never existed before. Because at the end of war, America disarmed. But the world had changed. And the presidency becomes independent of Congress, independent of the Constitution. And here we have this phenomenal diversity, this phenomenal paradox where the presidency operating in foreign policy and military policy is independent, while domestically he could be weak and piddly. Give you an example. In 1973, Congress believed that the War Powers Act would be a major curtailment on presidential power. It was a reaction to the Vietnam War. The belief was that if you want Congress on the landing, they should be there on the takeoff. Kind of corny expression. And of course, Congress was there, right? Wasn't explicit. I mean, Gulf of Tonkin resolution may have been exaggerated. But clearly, Congress knew what they were getting involved in when Lyndon Johnson moves from 18,000 troops to well over 500,000 troops. And then Richard Nixon's Vietnamization program is going much slower than many members of Congress desire. So in 1973, they passed this law. And this law has several provisions. The first provision, of course, is that the president should notify Congress before any military action if necessary, if possible. If it's not possible, within 48 hours, the president is to inform the Congress that American troops are in harm's way. And then the president is given 60 days to conduct whatever military operation that he desires. He can extend it another 30 days if he certifies that he needs that extra 30 days for the safe withdrawal of troops. If the president doesn't get an authorization, then he must remove those troops in the 90 days. And if there's a joint resolution, all right, then the president must remove those troops immediately, not subject to presidential veto. Right? Many people believed that this was the beginning of a return to constitutional balance, institutional balance. And of course, there were other laws that were passed, the Case Act, which basically said, imagine this. This is the, many of you familiar with the Bricker Amendment, which never got passed. But the Bricker Amendment basically say that all executive agreements must be passed by Congress. That didn't go very far. But the Case Act basically said, you know what, Mr. President, please let us know whenever you make an executive agreement. That's how wild it was. All right? And tell us which executive agreements are currently in effect. But you know what? It was a move in that direction of congressional balance. The third was the Hughes-Ryan Act. And contrary to everybody's thought, it wasn't Artie Hughes. That's right. One of our great heroes here. But the Hughes-Ryan Act basically said that presidents, if they want to engage in covert activity, all right, there is a finding that is usually presented by an intelligence agency, primarily the Central Intelligence Agency, and that the president would sign it. In other words, accountability. We don't want any rogue elephants. The CIA was sometimes perceived as a rogue elephant, or there was the deception that presidents are winking and nodding, we want something done, and then saying that we didn't know what was going on. So Hughes-Ryan, Case Act, the War Powers Act, all of this was meant to deal with war-making powers in the Cold War, in the age of nuclear weapons, in the age of globalization, in the age of interdependence. But it hasn't quite worked out that way. All right? Let me give you the first example. Jimmy Carter, when he attempted the rescue mission in Iran, he basically said, you know what? This is not a military action. This is a rescue mission. So the War Powers Act is not applicable. When Ronald Reagan decided that Kuwait, this is before the first Gulf War, I've got to keep track of here, all right, that Kuwait was worried that Iran was interfering with their shipping of oil. And of course, Kuwait is not much of a power, right? It's basically a fiefdom that was created at the end of the Ottoman Empire, basically for purposes of divide and conquer. Okay? The Sykes-Picot Agreement is a great example of political intrigue. Ambassador Metternich, Prince Metternich, would have been happy about Sykes-Picot, but we were not going to get too far. Kuwait, major source of oil. Ronald Reagan orders the reflagging of the Kuwaiti tankers, and then they would be escorted by American destroyers. In effect, Iran did not want to mess with the American destroyers. Is that an act of war? Did it involve the commencement of the War Powers Act? Well, Reagan said no, the way Carter had said no. In fact, we have a situation in which Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, George Herbert Walker Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama all argue that the War Powers Act is unconstitutional. Why? Because it violates, Commander-in-Chief violates U.S. versus Curtis Wright. We're now in a stage where presidents can engage in military action. We may argue that those military actions are a good thing or a bad thing. That's separate. Talking about the process. We're talking about democracy. We're talking about the Constitution. We're talking about accountability. Where the president says, if we are engaged in air power, if we don't have boots on the ground, if we're engaged with drones, it doesn't require the War Powers Act or any congressional authorization. This Constitution has evolved a great deal from Mr. Madison's Constitution. It's a Constitution that, by virtue of the occupants of the office, by Supreme Court decisions, by the practices of living in a complex, interdependent world where we become more vulnerable, has changed the balance. Yes, Aaron Wildowski was probably correct. We have two presidencies. One presidency domestically, very weak, maybe too weak. And we have another presidency in foreign affairs, very, very powerful, perhaps too powerful. Thank you very much. Lincoln articulated it best. He didn't follow it, but he articulated it well. When he said, you cannot have a democracy if one person can commit the nation to war. That there is no more powerful decision. Now, of course, Lincoln did exactly that. All right? So, walking the walk and whatever they call that, you know, I always get confused. Talk the walk the talk, walk the walk, whatever it is. All right? Now, clearly, there was the firing on Fort Sumter, and the Constitution was changed in Philadelphia. Originally, the words were, Congress shall make war. And they changed the words to Congress shall declare war. And this was James Wilson and Alexander Hamilton, because they wanted to leave open the possibility that the president could respond to attacks. The question that we have today is, what is an attack? If I believe you are building a missile, if I believe that you plan to attack me, clearly there's a logic, right, that if I don't respond, that would be to my jeopardy. The question becomes, if there is time, and there appears to be time, the role of Congress has been dismissed. And I think that presidents make a mistake when they ignore Congress. Not only can Congress affect budgets, but let me give you an example. In the first Gulf War, George Herbert Walker Bush basically argued what Harry Truman had argued, that since, excuse me, since the United States was a signatory to the United Nations, and the United Nations had authorized war, that there was no need for Congress to authorize war. Sort of an indirect. Well, first of all, the Treaty of Versailles, that was one of the reasons why the Treaty of Versailles was rejected. But secondly, the United Nations Charter specifically says, all right, that this does not preclude the authorization within each country. Now, the war, the Gulf War, at that time, when we look at public opinion, was maybe 55-45. But once Congress authorized that military action, it went up to about 85-90%. So there is a political benefit for involving the legislature when possible. When possible. And of course, Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta was a fascinating figure. I mean, here's a member, a former member of Congress, chairman of the Budget Committee. He served as the chief of staff in the Clinton administration, former CIA director, now Secretary of Defense. In his exchange with Senator Sessions, was talking about seeking permission from NATO, seeking permission from the Arab League, but never mentioning the Congress of the United States. And this is the type of discussion that I hope talks like this at least commence. How practical is it? But clearly, if you want to be on the landing, you have to have me on the takeoff. And certainly the Lincoln explanation of what is a democracy certainly comes to play. Now, you may conclude that democracy may be irrelevant in 2012. The problems that we face, the complexity, the interconnectedness, all prevent these things from happening. But that would be a major, major conclusion. Osama bin Laden had been active in the war zone under the two authorizations for military action. All right. He had taken credit, all right, for the 9/11 operation. What took place was a finding under the Hughes-Ryan Act, which gave it a legal protection. Clearly, as you rightly say, it would have been impossible to go on TV and say, we think we know where bin Laden is, and now we're going to have a discussion. No. I think he was within his clear authority to authorize that. All right. Plus, in Pakistan, it was in the area in which the movement of Al-Qaeda and other militants have been going back and forth. So one could argue it is within the theater of war. What is more complex, problematic, is these other questions. All right. Whether it's going into the Horn of Africa, whether it's supporting one side or another, where there's no immediate attack, no immediate threat to the United States, that wouldn't require some authorization from Congress. The second thing with al-Awlaki, who clearly was an inspirational leader, and Major Hassan, Fort Hood, claimed that he had correspondence with him. But there's no correspondence, at least to my knowledge, where al-Awlaki said, go kill as many soldiers at Fort Hood. So you have the problem there of speech versus conspiracy. While in the bin Laden case, you have clear connections in the war zone. All right? So these create some very interesting questions. The problem is Congress willing to reassert its constitutional responsibility? And if Congress is unwilling, then it's almost inconceivable that these authorities will at least be debated in terms of their proper form. Let me give you an example. There's talk on the, it's law now. The Congress recently voted on the Military Authorization Act that the President of the United States is empowered, all right, to kill or arrest any American and hold them without trial and maintain them in Guantanamo if necessary. So Congress is, in effect, codependent. I don't know if you want to use that term. I'm in the touchy-feely moment at this time, right? But clearly, Congress is a partner in some of these measures. When it comes to Syria, there is talk about members of Congress saying that the president should bomb Syria. And none of them are saying that there should be a congressional authorization. So there's a problem in terms of what the law is, what the Constitutional desires, but there's also the problem that Montesquieu and James Madison articulated. There has to be ambition, right, to counteract ambition. If there isn't that ambition to counteract ambition, then what we have is what Thomas Jefferson said is a parchment. And parchment rights and parchment powers are meaningless unless people are willing to expend their scarce political resources to defend them. That issue of whether it hurts his image. Clearly, we live in a dangerous world. And clearly, here is a Nobel Prize winner, obviously, but he's also President of the United States. And there is this notion of trying to get reelected, but also trying to be unified, stay true to what his principles may or may not be. Sometimes we're not always sure what president's principles are. But clearly, when the president says, I can go and kill a New Mexican-born American because I believe he's dangerous, or I can go into Libya, or I can go into the Horn of Africa without authorization, it raises questions about the constitutional connection, affiliation, right? Now, the problem is that he's not given a speech on this. He gives a speech on everything else. Give a speech on this. Explain to the American public where you're going. And of course, we could blame him or hold him accountable, but presidents have not done this, right? They have not attempted to explain. There was a great documentary, The Road to 9/11, and the notion, of course, what was happening in the 1990s, and the growth of Al-Qaeda, the growth of terrorist networks, and nothing was being done. And the notion of the President of the United States having that golden opportunity to explain to the American public, these are the dangers, these are the tools that I recommend. But presidents have not done that, all right? Bill Clinton didn't do it, George W. Bush didn't do it, and Barack Obama's not doing it. They're not explaining. If you listen to some of the speeches by Winston Churchill, they are remarkable in terms of not only telling the British people in the world the nature of the threat, but also saying what is the proper response to that threat. All right? So we've lost that dialogue. And maybe it's all laid at the feet of U.S. Curtis Wright, because we're saying that presidents could always go back and say, we have inherent powers and we don't need to explain what we do. Anybody else? Well, thank you. I hope you come on April 11th for Leadership in America, which I hope will cover some additional areas, but it'll deal with issues unrelated, I shouldn't say unrelated, but co-related to politics and life and how people lead. All right? Certainly, some of this suspects will always be there, like Lincoln and Martin Luther King and Roosevelt and others. All right? Thank you so much.